Hello, Rose, and today we're going to be talking about The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy by Benjamin Studebaker. Mr. Studebaker is a very impressive scholar and thinker. He's given some outstanding lectures and conversations at Theory Underground. I highly suggest them. His lecture on the good in Plato was remarkable. He has a profound grasp of political philosophy, and I really enjoyed his discussion with Cadell Last recently, which can be found on Philosophy Portal, that goes into some of the topics and some of the details for this text, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy. And I think Mr. Studebaker makes a very strong case that the way is shut, that political engagement, changing the political system, the economy, bringing about like a global tax system like Piketty talks about, these things are not possible. And that we need to accept that reality. He says at the end, this book is bleak. I do not deny it. But if we don't look clearly at the situation, then we might be trying to look for ways to fix it, what you could call the capital nation state from Coratani, and in a way wasting our eyes. Studebaker in his talk with Cadell mentioned that we need to be patient. The infinite patience of the concept is something Cadell has mentioned. I've talked about the faithful presence of Hunter and how today that may be what we're seeing on the liminal web outside of the institutional forces now belonging again to, we'll have to go into detail of that. But the point is that Studebaker will mention the need for us to keep our eyes open and to be watching for new developments and to be ready to jump on those potentials and opportunities and changes in conditions of possibility. And we simply will not do that. We will not be prepared if we're keeping our eyes on the capital nation state, looking for a way to change it, which is not possible, which in of itself, you could say, functions to the benefit of the capital nation state. If those of whom could perhaps seize upon the opportunity of a new condition of possibility are wasting their time watching or just paying attention to the capital nation state, then that actually benefits the capital nation state, because then those very people will not see conditions of possibility to open up new avenues of society, subjectivity, and so on and so forth. So the case that Studebaker is making, I think, is very, very important, so that we don't waste our eyes, we might say, so that we keep them open in the right direction, a clearing maybe in a Heideggerian sense, for something that could come forth. On page 15, he talks about Walter Schindler, who observes that once extraordinary inequalities of wealth and power take hold in a society, they are only very rarely disrupted. Historically, peaceful reform just hasn't managed to get the job done. Schindler identifies four forces that have shown a real capacity to substantially weaken or displace interest oligarchs: war, revolution, state collapse, and pandemics. But crucially, this doesn't mean that just any war or any pandemic will knock the oligarchs off their perch. The Iraq War didn't, COVID-19 didn't, to just kind of, those are examples that seem like they would have made a difference, but they did not. And, throughout the Iraq War and COVID-19, global supply chains continued to operate and capital remained mobile. These events not only failed to disrupt the accumulation of wealth by oligarchs, they accelerated it. In the face of events like these, the oligarchs are anti-fragile. They turn mild and moderate disorder to their advantage. When Schindler says, so this is still reading from the book, when Schindler says that wars and pandemics can produce leveling, so there's this idea of leveling, and Studebaker mentioned that with Cadell, he isn't talking about the kinds of wars and pandemics we've been having recently. He's talking about enormously horrific events like the World Wars and the Black Death. These events produced leveling because they were truly existential. And the example of the Black Death, there's this book by Paul, his last name, it's called The Silk Road. And it really talks about how the Black Death, which was so devastating, actually proved to be a great opportunity at the beginning of Europe's enrichment, which up to that point, the world was really, the Mongols were sweeping across Central Asia. You had the Persian empires. Europe was pretty backwards. But the Black Death actually opened opportunities. So there's these great leveling events, and more can be said. So there's this idea that if you really, the way is shut, and the only way to that might open it would be some truly devastating existential event, and do we really want that? We have to ask ourselves. So he has this other quote where so this is again from Walter. If history is anything to go by, peaceful policy reform may well prove unequal to the growing challenges ahead. But what of the alternatives? All of us who prize greater economic equality would do well to remember that with the rarest of exceptions, it was only ever brought forth in sorrow. Be careful what you wish for. I think that's very powerful. And so, there's really this idea that massive changes of the society require great horrors. And, we've also been talking a lot as well. We'd have to go into detail on it, but at the net, we've been talking about how capitalism really creates wealth through creative destruction, but there's a natural tendency of the winners of one wave of creative destruction to then want to turn around and stop the creative destruction precisely because they want it, which then leads to stagnancy, and the system then falls into having to stimulate wealth and demand, which then forms these very inequalities that Studebaker is talking about. It leads to rich oligarchs. You could talk about techno-feudalism, however you want to phrase it. And so capitalism that starts in a creative destruction, like a Schumpeter will talk about, Dietrich McCloskey, has a tendency to then fall into oligarchy and stuff like that. And if that's the case, and that creates stable unrest, social unrest, and so on and so forth, then there's something about capitalism that naturally leads to a need for geopolitical tension, domestic tensions, international tensions, and that capitalism without creative destruction tends toward war. So does that mean we need war today, to fix the dysfunctions of capitalism? Well, Studebaker makes a powerful argument that that may not work anymore because we've been enculturated out of the willingness to go to war, to engage in war, that we might be stuck with kind of these proxy wars like the Iraq War that are not existential. And maybe a pandemic, but then, COVID-19 shows that doesn't necessarily follow. I'm not sure. So Studebaker will just make the argument that the possibility of an existential threat that breaks up these entrenched inequalities may not be possible now. But then what hope do we have? Well, it may have something to do with keeping our eyes open in a faithful presence. He'll also talk about, I like how with Cadell, and he mentions it here in the book, on the 4 F's, and how these can be things that we turn to face with these great hopeless, this great kind of mediocrity, this great problem we have. He talks about faith, family, fandoms, and futurism, how we can withdraw, and it makes me think of Matthew Stanley's outstanding book on silence, on the temptation for an inward withdrawal to a private faith, which, we have our private relationship with Jesus and we're politically irrelevant, but we come to be comfortable with that because we have a private faith. Belonging again to, we'll talk about inward ranging, and how we get inwardly ranged by power to not impact power anymore. And, the government, the capital nation state doesn't even have to use force. It can just use power to inward range us. And I think these are just great examples, the 4 F's here, of how this goes, of how this works. And Studebaker has just a lot, the dream meeting democracy section. I like these reflections on the problem with the equality versus equity initiative. I think this is quite powerful stuff on how a lot of these efforts of reform don't necessarily they're not existential. Like these reforms don't lead to an existential confronting of the capital nation state. In fact, they can strengthen it because they break up the possibility of a collective worker movement or collective thinking of people. It makes tribes where everyone fights one another, and so on and so forth. I really do highly suggest this book. I think you should pick it up. There's a lot more to say about it. Chapter 5, he talks about kind of the Alfred. I like these reflections on Alfred, but on how there's this idea of the need for voice. And then to Hirschman, people can respond to dysfunctive systems in 2 ways. For Hirschman, they can exit the system or they can use voice to try to change it. And Studebaker and Studebaker will go through, and Justin Murphy has talked about Hirschman, and as is Samuel Barnes, on the idea that if you exit the system, well, you can't impact it. But then if the system has captured all means of voice changing it, what do you do? Or if people don't have the imaginative or the social imagination to make intelligible the voicing of new forms of subjectivity that the majority can understand, then how could voice work? I also really like the reflections, I think it's chapter 3, where he talks about how democracy today is always in crisis, but that doesn't mean it can't go on forever. Like crisis is not, here's the line. So he talks about various, so does that mean there is no crisis at all if democracy is there's no existential crisis? And there's a way in which there are these kind of mini crises, though, that are always at play to kind of keep people unable to organize, unable to get straight, kind of in a panic. I'm thinking of Paul Virilio here, Joshua Hansen, Owen's work on the perpetual crisis. They had an amazing conversation that I would highly suggest that you should check out. They're always doing really good work, and the Schizo FM is also, they had a particular conversation with Dr. James Simpkin on Virilio that I would suggest, and Dr. Simpkins is a great mind as well. He does really fascinating work on drone ethics. Anyway, but the idea is that we're in a kind of perpetual crisis, but this is not an existential crisis, and so he has this line where he says, political theorist Andrew Gamble argues democracy can be in crisis even when its survival is never called into question. And this is really important. Gamble makes a contrast situational crisis with structural crisis, and there are lots of situational crises but no structural crises. And that's actually a way that preserves the oligarchies, because there are all these situational crises that are never structural, so nothing really changed. So he's got those deadlocks lead to, so the deadlocks that these crises and et cetera so forth create, those deadlocks lead to a large number of situational crises, but none of these crisis moments threatens the survival of democracy. On the contrary, it is the fact that these moments of crisis do not threaten democracy that allows a structural crisis to continue producing moments of crisis. So what that means is, like, democracy right now is kind of structurally in a crisis of inequality that always manifests as situational crisis, but you can't have any like structural crisis in the sense of an existential crisis that could sublate the inequalities. So there is, in a sense, there is the structural crisis of the inequality itself, but that is ever preserved by the situational crisis that, in a Paul Virilio sense, keep us unable to function. But there is never any sort of possibility in this schema of a situational crisis that is an existential crisis to the structural dysfunction at play now. And so we're locked in. So there's a kind of, in Gamble's model, the fear is that each moment of crisis will just lead to further moments in an endless stream of misery. And that a crisis without end, which again makes me think of Virilio. And basically Studebaker is saying that's what we're in. And that these situational crises are smoke bombs that keep us, unable to change anything. And so the way is shut. Now, from my own take, the question that the book kind of leaves you with, or a question it leaves you with, there's a lot more in it, is if the way is shut, is that a hopeful thing to learn or a despairing way to learn? You know, I think we constantly kind of can feel, and Studebaker brought this up in his talk with Cadell, there's kind of feeling that you almost feel guilty to not be politically active or politically involved, or not, posting things here and there about political missions. You can kind of feel bad about it. And we talked a bit in Second Thoughts with the Grand Technology about this. But if you take seriously that the way is shut, you don't have to feel so bad about this, because it's not going to do anything. And there's a certain hopelessness of that. But there's also, I think, actually a kind of empowerment in that as well, because you're empowered against the anxiety you can feel about the guilt, the feeling you need to do something. Like, these are very strong forces that the culture puts upon people, these feelings to act, to do something, and guilt if you don't, that really can, I think, destroy people's lives. They can destroy their communities, destroy their relationships, destroy their mental health. It's really consequential. And so if you are convinced, so if this book convinces you the way is shut, in that very pessimism, I think there's something empowering about it, because then you don't worry about these things so much. And actually, if you don't worry about these things you can't change, you may actually save your time, energy toward things you can change and can impact for the better. I've been thinking more and more about how the liminal web, communities like Philosophy Portal, Theory Underground, Other Life, etc., Voicecraft, these are all examples of people as a kind of grassroots movement of different ways to spend your time. And I would say structure your subjectivity, because you're structuring it more philosophically according to a philosophical imagination. And I think, and it also models global pluralistic discussions between people of different first principles. Hunter would talk about substantive democracy. I think we see that modeled on the liminal web. And I think it also shows a way of life that is different from what is going on online. And if the way is shut in the major monoculture of the capital nation state, then you can be freed to focus on the liminal web and to develop your subjectivity according to that, and to devote your time and energy to that. And if it is true, and this case would have to be made in Belonging Again, if it is true that really what has made the world is not just, but it is not just social imagination, but it is profoundly influenced by social imagination, then if the liminal web is a grassroots movement of a different kind of subjectivity, then it is a grassroots movement of a change in subjectivity, a new form of subjectivity, which means a new form of social imagination. And if that really has a big impact on changing the world, then that is something we can do, however incremental and however small. And that could have universal impacts on the way people carry themselves. And I think that is worth time and energy. And by being freed from worrying about the capital nation state, which is, I think, a benediction of Studebaker's book, then we can focus on that. And then the other thing about focusing on that, the liminal web, to just use that as a catchphrase, is that we don't have to sacrifice the particular for the universal, which is always a tension. We don't have to sacrifice our immediate common lives and family and friends and all of that to focus on marching on Washington or something like that. We can have universal impact while maintaining particular change. And if at the end of the day the liminal web doesn't change the social imagination, there is still a profound change in ourselves as subjects and work on ourselves that we need, that the liminal web makes possible to help us come to terms with ourselves, because we're all walking contradictions full of problems and tensions and contradictions we need to work through, and the liminal web can help us with that. And then secondarily, as it does that, it has ways of functioning as a grassroots movement to change the social imagination. And if the way is shut on the capital nation state, then we are free and ought to focus on the development of that grassroots movement. For more by Benjamin Studebaker, I highly suggest checking out his book. You can pick it up on Amazon. Springler, you can get it as well. You'll find him on Theory Underground. I would check out his work. I really enjoyed the book. I think it is very informative, and thank you so much for your time.